What if I told you that everything you believe about prayer, meditation, and spiritual practice is actually a watered-down shadow of something infinitely more powerful that our ancestors knew and practiced daily? What if the reason your spiritual life feels empty, your manifestations fall flat, and your connection to the divine feels distant isn't because you lack faith, but because you've been taught to approach the numinous realm through the lens of modern religious institutions that have systematically stripped away the most potent elements of ancient invocation? For over 4 decades, I have studied the deepest recesses of the human psyche, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that the ancients possessed invocation methods so powerful, so psychologically sophisticated, that they could literally rewire the unconscious mind and open direct channels to what I call the archetypal realm. These weren't mere superstitions or primitive rituals, they were technologies of consciousness that modern psychology is only beginning to understand. The tragedy is that these methods have been deliberately obscured, hidden in plain sight within religious traditions that no longer understand their true purpose. What you're about to discover will fundamentally alter your relationship with the invisible forces that shape your reality. This isn't about belief systems or faith. This is about activating dormant psychological mechanisms that exist within every human being. Most people don't realize they're trapped in a spiritual wasteland of their own making, practicing diluted techniques that barely scratch the surface of what's possible when you understand how the psyche actually interfaces with the archetypal realm. They wonder why their prayers feel like they're bouncing off the ceiling, why their meditations leave them more anxious than peaceful, why their attempts at manifestation produce sporadic results at best. They continue to struggle with the same patterns, the same limitations, the same sense of spiritual emptiness, never understanding that they're using broken tools to dig for treasure. The symptoms are everywhere. You sit in meditation, but instead of transcendence, you experience a chattering mind that refuses to quiet. You pray for guidance, but the responses feel manufactured by your own wishful thinking rather than genuine divine communication. You attempt to manifest your desires, but find yourself caught in cycles of doubt, attachment, and frustration. You read spiritual books and attend workshops, yet feel more confused than ever about what actually works. You sense there's something more, something deeper, but every technique you try feels like you're grasping at shadows. This spiritual impotence creates a cascade of psychological wounds. You begin to doubt your own capacity for genuine spiritual experience. You develop what I call sacred skepticism, a protective mechanism that shields you from further disappointment by dismissing all spiritual practices as wishful thinking. You oscillate between desperate seeking and cynical withdrawal, never finding the stable ground of authentic spiritual practice. You watch others claim profound experiences and wonder if you're fundamentally broken, spiritually defective, or simply not chosen for such experiences. The hidden costs of this spiritual starvation permeate every aspect of your existence. Without a functional connection to the archetypal realm, you remain trapped in the narrow confines of ego consciousness, cut off from the vast reservoir of wisdom and power that should be your birthright. Your decision-making becomes reactive rather than inspired. Your creativity withers without access to the divine source of all innovation. Your relationships lack the depth that comes from recognizing the sacred in others. Your work feels meaningless because you cannot sense its connection to the larger cosmic unfolding. Most tragic of all, you begin to accept this diminished state as normal, telling yourself that spiritual experience is either imaginary or reserved for special people in special circumstances. You settle for second-hand spirituality, consuming the insights of others rather than developing your own direct relationship with the numinous. You become a spiritual tourist, sampling traditions without ever finding one that truly transforms you. The reason conventional approaches fail is that they treat invocation as a mental activity rather than a complete reorganization of consciousness. Modern religious and spiritual practices have been sanitized, psychologized, and stripped of their transformative power. They focus on belief rather than direct experience, on moral behavior rather than consciousness expansion, on community participation rather than individual initiation into the mysteries. They give you the form without the essence, the shell without the pearl. What makes this tragedy even more profound is that the authentic methods still exist, preserved in the deepest layers of ancient traditions, waiting for those who have the psychological sophistication to recognize and activate them. These aren't exotic practices requiring years of preparation or special genetic predispositions. They are universal human capacities that have been systematically suppressed by cultures that fear the power of individuals who can access archetypal wisdom directly. I'm going to share with you 5 proven invocation methods that I've extracted from decades of research into alchemy, mythology, and the psychology of spiritual experience. These aren't theoretical concepts or philosophical abstractions. They are practical techniques backed by the deepest insights of analytical psychology and validated by the consistent experiences of individuals across cultures and centuries who have successfully activated their capacity for authentic spiritual communion. The scientific foundation for these methods lies in our growing understanding of the unconscious mind and its relationship to what I call the collective unconscious, the shared psychological inheritance of humanity that contains all the archetypal patterns and energies that have shaped human experience since the beginning of consciousness. Modern neuroscience is beginning to validate what the ancients knew intuitively, that consciousness is not produced by the brain but rather received and filtered by it, like a radio tuning into specific frequencies. What separates those who achieve genuine spiritual communion from those who remain trapped in superficial practice is not their level of faith or devotion, but their willingness to engage with the psyche as it actually functions rather than as religious institutions pretend it functions. The successful practitioners understand that invocation is not about begging external deities for favors, but about aligning consciousness with archetypal energies that are always present but usually unconscious. They know that the goal is not to escape human nature but to fulfill it by integrating the personal unconscious with the transpersonal realm. When you master these 5 methods, you'll never approach spiritual practice the same way again. You'll understand why your previous attempts felt hollow and how to create consistent, reliable access to states of consciousness that most people only glimpse in moments of crisis or spontaneous breakthrough. You'll develop what I call archetypal literacy, the ability to read the symbolic language through which the unconscious communicates with consciousness. Most importantly, you'll discover that genuine spiritual experience is not a luxury for the specially gifted, but your natural inheritance as a conscious being. The journey ahead will challenge everything you think you know about how a spiritual transformation actually occurs, but the reward is nothing less than the recovery of your full psychological and spiritual potential. The first method the ancients understood, which modern practitioners have almost completely forgotten, is what I call symbolic resonance, the art of using archetypal symbols not as representations of something else, but as living psychological entities that can be activated within consciousness. But here's what most people miss. Symbols aren't just pictures or mental concepts. They are condensed experiences, crystallized patterns of energy that exist independently in the collective unconscious and can be invoked to reorganize your entire psychological structure. Think of a symbol like a seed. A rose seed doesn't represent a rose. It contains the entire pattern, the complete blueprint, everything necessary to manifest a rose under the right conditions. Similarly, archetypal symbols contain complete patterns of consciousness that, when properly activated, unfold into transformative experiences. Most people treat symbols like pictures in a book, interesting to look at, but ultimately separate from themselves. The ancients understood symbols as psychological DNA, capable of rewriting the very structure of consciousness. Consider the symbol of the tree. To most people, this represents growth, nature, perhaps rootedness, and reaching toward light. But to the initiate, who understands symbolic resonance, the tree symbol contains the entire pattern of the world axis, the connection between unconscious depths, conscious awareness, and transpersonal heights. When properly invoked, this symbol doesn't just remind you of these concepts, it actually reorganizes your consciousness along these lines, creating a direct experience of being rooted in the unconscious while reaching toward transcendent awareness. Here's another analogy. Imagine consciousness as a vast ocean and symbols as tuning forks. When you strike a tuning fork underwater, it creates specific vibrational patterns that ripple out through the entire body of water. Archetypal symbols function the same way in consciousness. When properly activated, they create vibrational patterns that ripple through your entire psychological field, awakening dormant potentials and organizing consciousness around archetypal principles. The neurological basis for this phenomenon lies in what researchers call semantic networks, minus interconnected webs of meaning and association that exist below the threshold of conscious awareness. When you engage with a symbol superficially, you activate only the most obvious associations. But when you invoke a symbol with the proper psychological attitude, you activate the entire network, creating cascading changes throughout consciousness that can persist for days, weeks, or even permanently. What's particularly fascinating is how this process works in reverse when people misunderstand symbolic engagement. Instead of allowing symbols to reorganize consciousness toward greater integration and power, they project their limited personal associations onto archetypal symbols, thereby reducing vast cosmic principles to mere personal preferences or cultural conditioning. I've observed countless individuals who encounter powerful symbols like the mandala, the cross, or the serpent, but instead of allowing these symbols to expand their consciousness, they immediately reduce them to familiar categories, thereby missing entirely the transformative potential. Think about a time when you encountered a symbol that stirred something deep within you. Perhaps in a dream, during meditation, or while contemplating a work of art. Notice how the symbol seemed to contain more meaning than you could rationally explain, how it evoked feelings and insights that went far beyond its obvious associations. This is your psyche recognizing the presence of an archetypal pattern, trying to establish resonance with forces larger than personal consciousness. The key to mastering symbolic resonance lies in developing what I call symbolic receptivity, the ability to encounter symbols without immediately explaining them away or reducing them to personal meanings. This requires a fundamental shift in how you approach spiritual practice, moving from the attitude of a consumer trying to extract meaning to that of a participant, allowing meaning to transform you. The second transformation that every ancient tradition recognized as essential is what I call archetypal identification, the ability to temporarily dissolve the boundaries of personal identity and align consciousness with archetypal energies. Most people approach spirituality trying to improve or perfect their existing identity, never realizing that the very structure of personal identity is what prevents deeper spiritual experience. The ego, necessary as it is for daily functioning, is fundamentally designed to maintain separation and control, which are antithetical to spiritual communion. Here's where conventional wisdom gets it completely wrong. Most spiritual teachings tell you to transcend or eliminate the ego, creating an impossible and psychologically dangerous goal. The ancients understood something far more sophisticated, that consciousness is naturally fluid, capable of shifting between different modes of organization depending on what the situation requires. Personal identity is just one possible configuration of consciousness, useful for certain purposes but limiting for others. The psychological mechanism behind archetypal identification involves what I call ego elasticity, the capacity to temporarily expand or contract the boundaries of personal identity without losing psychological coherence. This isn't dissociation or fantasy, it's a deliberate, conscious shift into a broader identity structure that can accommodate archetypal energies. Think of it like changing clothes for different activities. You wouldn't wear a business suit to go swimming, and you wouldn't wear a swimsuit to a formal dinner. When you master this capacity, something extraordinary happens. Instead of trying to force spiritual experiences through the narrow filter of personal consciousness, you temporarily become a suitable vessel for archetypal energies to express themselves. This is why shamans, mystics, and genuine spiritual practitioners throughout history have all developed techniques for ritual identity shifting. They understood that certain types of consciousness are only accessible when you expand beyond the confines of personal identity. The most common mental block that prevents this shift is what I call identity attachment. The unconscious belief that you are nothing more than your personal identity, that losing temporary awareness of your personal boundaries equals psychological death. This fear keeps people trapped in spiritual practices that merely rearrange the contents of personal consciousness rather than expanding into transpersonal awareness. They practice meditation to become better people rather than to temporarily transcend the limitations of personal perspective. Another major obstacle is spiritual materialism. The attempt to collect spiritual experiences as possessions for the ego rather than allowing spiritual energies to temporarily replace ego consciousness entirely. You can recognize this pattern when spiritual practice becomes about accumulating insights, states, or experiences that you can own, compare, or use to establish your spiritual superiority over others. The solution involves developing what I call identity fluidity, the recognition that consciousness is not identical with any particular organization of identity, that your true nature is the awareness that can observe and temporarily adopt different identity structures as needed. This requires regular practice of consciously shifting between different archetypal perspectives, not as role-playing or imagination, but as genuine psychological transformation. Begin by selecting an archetypal energy that resonates with your current life situation. Perhaps the warrior when facing challenges, the wise elder when needing guidance, or the divine lover when opening to deeper intimacy. Spend time studying this archetype through mythology, art, and literature until you can sense its essential psychological pattern. Then practice periods of conscious identification, temporarily allowing this archetypal energy to organize your consciousness while maintaining enough witness awareness to prevent complete unconscious possession. The third method that separates authentic invocation from spiritual pretense is what I call temporal dissolution, this systematic dismantling of linear time consciousness to access the eternal now where all spiritual energies reside. Elite performers in every field, from athletes to artists to mystics, have discovered that peak performance and genuine spiritual experience both require stepping outside ordinary time consciousness into what physicists now recognize as the quantum field of infinite possibility. The brain science behind this technique reveals why it's so powerful. Our normal state of consciousness is dominated by what neuroscientists call the default mode network, a collection of brain regions that maintains our sense of being a separate self moving through linear time. This network is constantly generating the story of me in time, creating the psychological framework that keeps us trapped in past conditioning and future anxiety. When this network quiets, as it does during deep meditation, psychedelic experiences, or moments of flow, consciousness expands beyond personal boundaries and gains access to what mystics have always called the eternal dimension. The step-by-step implementation begins with understanding that time consciousness is not fixed reality, but a particular way of organizing experience. Ancient practitioners developed sophisticated techniques for temporarily suspending linear time awareness and accessing what they called the eternal moment. Not a moment in time, but the timeless presence from which all moments arise. This isn't philosophical theory, it's a concrete psychological skill that can be developed through practice. First, you must recognize how deeply conditioned you are to experience life through temporal filters. Every thought, emotion, and sensation gets immediately categorized as past, present, or future, creating an artificial stream of sequential experience that obscures the underlying timeless awareness. Begin by spending periods of focused attention on the gaps between thoughts, the spaces between breaths, the stillness between movements. These gaps are windows into timeless consciousness. Second, practice what I call chronological rebellion, deliberately disrupting your habitual relationship with sequential time. Instead of organizing your day around clock time, organize periods around states of consciousness. Instead of asking, "What time is it?" ask, "What quality of presence am I cultivating right now?" Instead of rushing toward future goals, practice being fully available to whatever reality is presenting in this moment. Third, develop the capacity for eternal recurrence, the ability to experience each moment as if it were both the first time and the eternal time, containing all moments within itself. This isn't repetition but recognition that the deeper you penetrate any single moment of experience, the more it reveals the timeless patterns that underlie all experience. Common mistakes include trying to force timeless states through mental effort, which only strengthens temporal consciousness, or treating temporal dissolution as escape from present responsibilities, rather than as deeper engagement with the eternal dimension of present experience. Another error is confusing temporal dissolution with spacing out or dissociation. Authentic temporal dissolution increases rather than decreases awareness, expanding consciousness beyond time while remaining fully grounded in immediate reality. The key is understanding that you're not trying to eliminate time consciousness, but to recognize it as one possible filter among many. When you can consciously shift between temporal and eternal awareness as the situation requires, you gain access to spiritual energies that exist outside the flow of linear time, including what the ancients called prophetic consciousness, healing, presence, and the capacity for what modern psychology recognizes as peak experiences that reorganize consciousness around transpersonal principles. This practice compounds over time by gradually weakening your unconscious identification with temporal sequencing while strengthening your capacity to dwell in what mystics call the eternal now. Eventually, you develop what I call temporal bilingualism, the ability to function effectively in clock time while maintaining conscious access to timeless awareness, allowing spiritual energies to inform and guide your temporal activities without disrupting practical effectiveness. The fourth method involves mastering what I call the invocation spiral, a systematic process that creates a reliable pathway from ordinary consciousness to authentic spiritual communion. Unlike linear techniques that try to force spiritual experiences through effort and will, the invocation spiral works by creating optimal psychological conditions for archetypal energies to emerge naturally from the unconscious. The system works because it mirrors the natural process through which the psyche organizes itself when not interfered with by conscious manipulation. Think of it like creating a garden. You don't force plants to grow, but you prepare the soil, provide water and sunlight, and remove obstacles that prevent the natural growth. Similarly, the invocation spiral doesn't force spiritual experiences, but creates psychological conditions where they can emerge organically. The technical mechanism involves what I call graduated consciousness expansion, a step-by-step process that gradually dissolves the defensive structures that normally prevent ego consciousness from accessing deeper psychological layers. Most people approach spiritual practice like trying to demolish a wall with a sledgehammer, creating psychological resistance and defensive reactions. The invocation spiral works like water, gradually penetrating rock, creating no resistance, because it follows the natural pathways that already exist within consciousness. The first spiral involves grounding in present moment awareness, not as a meditative technique but as psychological preparation for deeper communion. You begin by establishing what I call witness consciousness, the capacity to observe your thoughts, emotions, and sensations without being completely identified with them. This creates enough psychological space for spiritual energies to enter without overwhelming the ego structure. The second spiral expands this awareness to include what I call somatic resonance, the recognition that your body is not just a physical object, but a sensitive instrument capable of detecting and responding to archetypal energies. You learn to read the subtle signals that indicate when spiritual forces are attempting to communicate, developing what shamans call body wisdom, or what I describe as archetypal sensitivity. The third spiral opens the emotional field through what I call feeling tone calibration. The ability to distinguish between personal emotions generated by psychological conditioning and archetypal emotions that arise from contact with transpersonal energies. This is crucial because authentic spiritual experience always involves emotional transformation, but most people confuse psychological processing with spiritual communion. The fourth spiral engages the imagination not as fantasy, but as what I call active imagination, the conscious participation in the image-making function of the psyche to create receptivity for archetypal content. This isn't visualization in the sense of mentally creating images, but rather the cultivation of imaginal receptivity that allows spiritual energies to express themselves through spontaneous imagery. The final spiral integrates all previous levels through what I call archetypal embodiment, the temporary but complete alignment of consciousness with specific spiritual energies, creating authentic communion rather than mere psychological experience. At this level, you're no longer practicing invocation, you've become the invocation itself. Before and after transformation scenarios reveal the power of this systematic approach. Before mastering the invocation spiral, spiritual practice feels erratic, dependent on mood, circumstances, or luck. Sometimes you have profound experiences, sometimes nothing happens, and you never understand why. After developing this systematic spiritual communion becomes as reliable as any other skill you've mastered, available whenever you need guidance, healing, or connection to transpersonal wisdom. The system works when others fail because it addresses the complete psychological structure rather than focusing on isolated techniques. It prevents the self-sabotage patterns that emerge when people try to force spiritual experiences without adequately preparing consciousness to receive them. The fifth and most immediately powerful method is what I call ritual embodiment, the use of specific physical actions to activate psychological states that naturally invoke archetypal energies. Unlike the mental or emotional approaches most people associate with spiritual practice, ritual embodiment recognizes that consciousness and body are not separate entities, but different aspects of a unified field, and that physical actions can directly reorganize consciousness in ways that purely mental practices cannot achieve. The power of physical action in spiritual practice lies in what neuroscientists call embodied cognition, the recognition that thinking, feeling, and experiencing are not confined to the brain, but distributed throughout the entire nervous system. When you engage in specific physical actions with conscious intention, you activate neural pathways that can dramatically alter consciousness, often more quickly and reliably than meditation or contemplation alone. You can implement ritual embodiment through multiple pathways, each designed to activate different aspects of archetypal consciousness. The first approach involves what I call sacred geometry embodiment, using body positions and movements that mirror cosmic principles. Ancient traditions understood that specific postures don't just represent spiritual principles, but actually embody them, creating physical templates that organize consciousness along archetypal lines. For example, standing with arms raised to form the ancient sign of the kine, arms extended upward, like branches reaching toward heaven, while feet remain rooted in earth, doesn't symbolize the connection between earth and sky. It creates this connection through the physical alignment of your nervous system with these cosmic principles. Your body becomes a living antenna tuned to receive spiritual energies that flow between terrestrial and celestial dimensions. The second implementation involves elemental attunement, physical practices that align your body with the fundamental energies that ancient traditions recognized as the building blocks of all manifestation. This might involve specific breathing patterns that activate what Taoists call dragon breath, or movement sequences that allow your body to embody the flowing quality of water, the stability of earth, the expansiveness of air, or the transformative power of fire. A third approach uses rhythmic entrainment, the systematic use of sound, movement and breath to synchronize your nervous system with archetypal frequencies. Ancient shamanic traditions understood that consciousness naturally aligns with whatever rhythmic patterns it's exposed to, and developed sophisticated techniques for using drum beats, chanting, and movement to induce specific states of consciousness reliably. The historical validation for these practices spans every spiritual tradition that has achieved consistent results in producing authentic spiritual experience. From the whirling of Sufi dervishes to the prostrations of Tibetan practitioners, from the mudras of Hindu yoga to the ritual dances of indigenous shamans, every tradition that has successfully transmitted spiritual wisdom across generations has incorporated physical practices that embody rather than merely represent spiritual principles. What makes physical action more powerful than mental practice alone is its capacity to bypass the rational mind that often interferes with spiritual experience through analysis, doubt, and control. When you engage your body in ritual action, you activate what I call somatic wisdom, the intelligence of the nervous system that operates below the threshold of conscious thought, but can reorganize consciousness more rapidly and thoroughly than mental practices. The timing and frequency of ritual embodiment depends on your specific intentions and circumstances, but the general principle is that regular practice creates what I call archetypal momentum, a cumulative effect where each session builds on previous ones, gradually establishing stable pathways between ordinary consciousness and spiritual awareness. Daily practice, even for brief periods, proves more effective than sporadic intensive sessions because it establishes consistent neural pathways. What's particularly important is understanding that ritual embodiment isn't about performing specific movements correctly, but about embodying specific qualities of consciousness through physical expression. The external form serves the internal transformation, not the reverse. This means you can adapt traditional practices to your specific circumstances while maintaining their essential spiritual function. The momentum building aspect occurs because ritual embodiment creates what neuroscientists call neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to reorganize itself around new patterns of experience. Each time you engage in conscious physical practice with spiritual intention, you strengthen neural pathways that make spiritual states more accessible and stable. Over time, these states become increasingly natural and effortless. Understanding the psychology of implementation is crucial because knowledge without application remains sterile, and application without psychological insight often fails to produce lasting transformation. The reason most people struggle to integrate new spiritual practices isn't lack of information, but failure to address the psychological resistance that emerges whenever consciousness attempts to reorganize itself around new patterns. The first psychological principle involves identity transformation rather than identity improvement. Most people approach spiritual with the unconscious goal of becoming a better version of who they already are, never realizing that genuine spiritual development requires becoming someone fundamentally different. This creates internal conflict because part of you wants transformation while another part desperately wants to maintain familiar identity structures. The solution involves shifting from improvement consciousness to evolution consciousness, recognizing that spiritual development is not about perfecting your current identity, but about growing into a larger identity that can accommodate both personal and transpersonal dimensions of experience. This requires grieving the loss of your smaller self while celebrating the emergence of your expanded self. Certainty building becomes essential because spiritual practice inevitably involves periods of uncertainty, confusion, and what mystics call dark nights of the soul, where old structures have dissolved but new ones haven't yet stabilized. During these transitional periods, your success depends not on maintaining constant clarity, but on developing what I call uncertainty tolerance, the capacity to continue practicing even when you can't see immediate results. The language you use during these periods literally shapes the neural pathways that determine whether you persist or abandon your practice. Instead of saying, if this works, use when this transformation completes itself. Instead of I'm trying to develop, say I am developing. Instead of I hope to experience, say I am learning to recognize the spiritual experiences that are already present. Previous attempts may have failed not because the practices were ineffective, but because you approached them with psychological assumptions that prevented success. Many people unconsciously sabotage spiritual practice because they fear the identity changes that genuine spiritual development requires. Others abandon practices too quickly because they expect immediate dramatic results rather than understanding that authentic transformation occurs gradually, often below the threshold of conscious recognition. The key insight is that spiritual development follows biological rather than mechanical principle. It's more like growing a plant than building a machine. Plants don't grow in straight lines or according to predetermined schedules. They grow through cycles of expansion and consolidation, visible growth and invisible root development, seasonal flourishing and seasonal dormancy. Understanding this prevents the discouragement that leads most people to abandon practices just before they begin producing consistent results. When you recognize that resistance, confusion, and temporary setbacks are normal aspects of consciousness reorganizing itself rather than signs of failure or inadequacy, you develop the psychological resilience necessary for long-term spiritual development. You stop interpreting temporary difficulties as evidence that you're doing something wrong and start recognizing them as signs that something significant is happening below the surface of awareness. This shift from victim consciousness to creator consciousness represents perhaps the most important psychological transformation required for spiritual mastery. Instead of seeing yourself as someone trying to achieve spiritual experiences, you begin recognizing yourself as consciousness itself, learning to access its own deeper dimensions. This isn't positive thinking or self-hypnosis. It's psychological accuracy based on the recognition that what you call your consciousness is actually localized universal consciousness, exploring itself through the apparent limitations of individual perspective. Now we arrive at a crucial moment where knowledge transforms into wisdom through action. Everything I've shared with you represents thousands of years of accumulated understanding about how consciousness actually functions and how human beings can reliably access the archetypal energies that transform life from mere survival into genuine fulfillment. But understanding these principles intellectually accomplishes nothing without implementation. What we've explored today represents the completion of a circle that began with your intuitive recognition that something essential was missing from conventional spiritual approaches. You sensed that deeper possibilities existed, that genuine spiritual communion was more than wishful thinking or cultural conditioning, that human consciousness contained dormant capacities waiting to be activated. The five methods we've discussed provide the practical pathway from that initial intuition to consistent, reliable access to archetypal wisdom. Remember that you're not trying to achieve something foreign to your essential nature, but to recover capacities that are your birthright as a conscious being. The archetypal energies we've discussed don't exist in some distant spiritual realm, but in the deepest layers of your own psyche, waiting for the proper conditions to emerge into conscious awareness. Every technique, every practice, every method serves the single purpose of removing the psychological obstacles that prevent you from recognizing what has always been present. As you begin implementing these practices, remember that transformation happens not through force but through persistent, gentle attention to the conditions that allow consciousness to reorganize itself around archetypal principles. You're not becoming someone different, but becoming who you've always been beneath the layers of conditioning and limitation. Take the first step today. Choose the method that most strongly resonates with your current situation and begin a daily practice, even if only for 10 minutes. Notice what happens when you approach spiritual practice not as a seeking for something outside yourself, but as a recognition of capacities that are already present within consciousness itself. Share your experiences with others who are walking this path, and remember that every step forward contributes not only to your own development but to the collective awakening of human consciousness to its own deeper possibilities. The ancient methods are no longer hidden. The question now is whether you will have the courage to claim them as your own.